Hi, welcome back to Binkerbelle's Yarning. Today is Wednesday, October 16th, and it's We Learn Wednesday. Today we're actually going to talk about the differences between knitting and crochet. I know a lot of people sort of know the differences, but not completely, outside of the fact that you use needles for knitting and hooks for crochet. There's actually a considerable difference between them. Before we get to that though, tomorrow marks my 100th video. Crazy. I can't believe we're already there. It's very exciting, to be completely honest with you. So I want to know from you guys what we should do to celebrate. Right, it is Nifty Things Thursday, and I do have something set aside for it. But I also want to know what you guys want to do to celebrate. Anyway, so leave a comment in below, and yeah, let me know how we should celebrate this. Okay, so back to the topic of the day. So the differences between knitting and crochet. So we'll start with the similarities, and then we'll move through the categories accordingly. So both knitting and crochet use yarn or fiber to create fabric. I know that sounds funny, but that's exactly what you're doing, is you're creating pieces of fabric. You can create the same types of products, such as sweaters, shawls, wraps, blankets, afghans, scarves, hats, mitts, wraps, socks. Socks used to be only created by knitting, but that now there are tons of crochet sock patterns out there. They both use patterns with abbreviations. Some of them are very much the same, such as yarn over, continue, repeat, that kind of stuff. They both require hand-eye coordination and an eye for color and design, as well as the ability to plan a project from start to finish and the patience to finish it. Both of them also offer great health benefits. So we've actually taken a look at fiber art as therapy. So if you want to take a look at that video, I'll post the link to it in the description section. So the physical differences between knitting and crochet. They both use similar yet very different stashes and supplies. Knitting has a tendency to choose different types of yarn and look for different types of characteristics in that yarn and the fibers, more so than crochet. Taking a look at whether your yarn will split or catch on itself is very important more important for crocheters than it is for knitters. Because when you need to pull stitches out, because crochet has a tendency to have wraps around itself, like the actual yarn wraps around itself to create stitches. Pulling out your stitches is much easier when the yarn isn't fuzzy and catching on itself. Same thing with splitting. It's another issue, because when you pull the hook through a stitch, sometimes the bottom of it will catch on the yarn and it'll split it, and then you just have a mess. Knitters also take a look at, knitters as opposed to crocheters take a look at the elasticity of the yarn itself, so how well it stretches on its own, and that actually is for drape purposes. The ability to see stitch definition is more important for crocheters, so such a yarn such as pipsqueak, which is furry, is something that you would use more often with knitting than with crochet, because it's easier to see the stitches when you're knitting, whereas you can't very well see them with crochet as easily. Same thing with eyelash yarns. Knitters have a tendency to use that more often than crocheters do. Crochet uses thread in a lot of patterns, so if you're doing doilies and fancy bedspreads and tablecloths and stuff like that, or like Frances Brown did with the miniatures, she uses a thread as well, and a very small hook. Knitters have a tendency not to use threads. It's just tedious and finicky and not something that's really built for knitters, whereas there's tons of thread patterns out there for crocheters. So that's the differences in yarns. We'll move on to the differences in tools. So hand knitters use two pointed needles, either as a set or as connected by a cable. So, well, they use more. I mean, when you're making socks and mitts or working in the round, you have a tendency to use 3 to 5 needles, but they're double-ended pointed needles. whereas crochet uses a single hook. Right, there's the actual most obvious difference between them. Knitting can be done on looms and by machine. Crochet cannot. There is something out there called a crochet machine, but it doesn't make the same kind of stitches as crochet does. It creates a blanket stitch. So I know a lot of you out there who crochet have made a blanket stitch before. The thing is, when you look at the fabric that is produced by the crochet machine, you'll actually notice that it does not resemble crochet at all. Whereas knitting machines and looms do very much look like knitting, because they are. Knitted items can be easily mass produced, whereas crochet items can't. You will never find anything out there that is crocheted that is not done by hand. It's just not possible. You can't replicate the stitches. So knitting involves the manipulation of multiple loops that build upon each other, and each stitch requires the support of the one below it. Whereas crochet only uses one active loop, of course, except for when you're doing specialty projects and stitches such as broomstick lace. The stitch, if a stitch is missed in knitting or dropped, then the entire column might unravel, right? Well, more than likely will unravel. So knitting unravels a lot easier than crochet does, because of the way that the stitches are twisted in crochet. Crochet uses a single loop, like a single active loop, like I said, and it does require the stitch below for support, but not in the same way as knitting. So if you miss a stitch or you drop a stitch in well, you can't really drop a stitch in crochet. Now we're excluding Tunisian in this conversation. So anyway, so if you drop a stitch or you miss a stitch in crochet, it's not a big deal, right? You can fix it easily on the next row or whatever, and it won't unravel anywhere except on the active loop. So if you pull on the active loop, then you'll unravel it. Whereas knitting, any loop that's been dropped will result in unraveling. So knitting allows for better drape and flexibility of the fabric created. It's just the nature of the fabric itself. And I'm not saying that crochet doesn't give nice drape and flexibility. It's just knitting has a tendency to drape easier. Whereas crochet allows for more intricate shapes and details within the fabric itself. So it's easier to overlay crochet than it is to overlay knit. It's just the way it is. Knitting has a very finite number of different stitches that you can use. And they're basically combinations of knit stitch and purl stitch, and how you arrange those particular stitches will determine the stitch sequence and the look and texture of the fabric that you're making. Whereas crochet has, at this point, I don't even know how many stitches are out there. Thing is, you're using 6 basic stitches. Well, basically you're using 6 basic stitches. So you have your chain stitch, your slip stitch, your single crochet, your half double crochet, double crochet, and triple crochet. Yes, they do go past that. So you have your double triples and so on and so forth. So you can make nice long extended stitches simply by wrapping your yarn around the hook more. But for the most part, there are 6 basic stitches. When those stitches are put in different sequences or closed in different ways, then you're actually building stitch sequences. So things such as the moss stitch, it's actually a moss stitch sequence, right? So it's a series of repetitive stitches in a specific pattern that creates that look of the moss stitch. And again, you can do that with knitting, but it's not as versatile when it comes to stitches and looks that you can get. There's a finite number of combinations you can make with 2 stitches. There is probably a finite number of ways you can combine crochet stitches, but the number is significantly larger simply because you're working with more than with knitting. So hopefully that gives you guys a good understanding of the differences between the two. It is a question that I've been asked on multiple occasions. if you guys want me to go into more detail on anything, or if I missed something or any of that, then let me know in the comment section. And again, tomorrow's my 100th video, so let me know what you guys want to do to celebrate. All right, we'll see you later. Have a good day.